It's episode 59 of This Week in Creationism. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we take a look at the headlines in the world of creationism over the past couple weeks. We've got coming up Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark's been found? Really? Answers in Genesis is going to quadruple down on dino feathers. Dr. Carter at Creation Ministries International is coming out with a new video about how ancient DNA reveals man's ancestry. Plus, we have a message from new CEO Martin Iles of Answers in Genesis. We've got that and a whole bunch more coming right up. Oh, we've got a whole bunch of stuff to cover here. Got a lot of different headlines. And let's just kick it off with, has Noah's Ark been found? This seems to come out like, about once every year or two, there'll be a story about Noah's Ark having been found or possible evidence of Noah's Ark being found. And there's all kinds of new interest raised and a bunch of, it gets picked up by a lot of media and some talk. And you'll find Christians discussing this evidence and asking their pastors, what's the meaning of it? Well, this is the next round, the next volley of potential evidence of Noah's Ark being found. This time it was promoted by a couple of British tabloids, and it then once again spread on social media, got picked up by a couple Christian news sites, and this resulted in Answers in Genesis having to respond to these articles as they have in the past. Because of course Answers in Genesis is your premier defender of a particular literal view of the origins of the world, in which Noah landed on the mountains of Ararat after a global flood. And surely one of the most powerful evidences that that is a particular historical event in the nature that Answers in Genesis promotes it as, would be the finding of an actual ark, all right? Noah's actual ark. And so there's always Christians out there. There's always people out there that are intensely interested in the search for Noah's Ark, because they feel like that's kind of like that is the final, it would be the final straw for some people to finally convince them. It would be like the most convincing data of the biblical narrative, and therefore force people to take the biblical narrative seriously if Noah's Ark were to be found. And so there's just always been this intense interest in this particular historical artifact and its literal reality, above and beyond almost anything except maybe pieces of the cross or something like that. So has Noah's Ark been found? Archaeologists reveal ruins found in Turkey's boat-shaped mound date back to about 5,000 years ago, the same period as the biblical flood. Well, now, according to Answers in Genesis, it's actually 4,350 years. So this is actually a little bit too old for the Genesis flood, according to the leading creationists. Yeah, here's the sun. They pick up on that articles too. No way has Noah's Ark been found, right? Look at that rock formation. Maybe that's a petrified ark. And if we were just to go in and actually collect some evidence there, maybe we could prove that that is the ark. This is an old claim. Even that particular location is a fairly old claim. And like I said before, these claims come up every couple of years and then they're debunked quite quickly. Just a little tiny bit from that article. Calculations put these samples at the same time as the biblical flood. What calculations? One of the other articles mentions they haven't really done any carbon dating or anything that is like fairly substantial dating. It's sort of like, well, these appear to be kind of old stuff, right? And then they put this 5,000-year-old date on it. Archaeologists believe they're one step closer to confirming the resting place of Noah's Ark. And you know what would get them one step close? Yeah, another step closer is if you donated a whole bunch of money to their cause. Honestly, this is one of the this is a great grifting operation, is what it is. They know Christians are really interested in finding the ark, and they know that if they were to just say, like, if we could just raise another $500,000, we'd finally find that real evidence, right? We'd be able to actually climb up into the mountains of Ararat. We'd be able to collect the samples we want. We'd be able to process them in a way that would provide the final proof. We just need you to write that check, right? We need you to like transfer your money from your bank account to ours and we'll do the rest. I think that's what this is really about. A team excavating a geological formation in Turkey has aged rock and soil samples. Again, no publication goes with this. Nothing I saw in any of the articles that I looked at that actually suggest even what kind of aging that is. Just a claim, right? They've aged this. And they believe contains ruins of a vessel, which puts the site at the same time as the biblical flood. The project began in 2021, is ongoing. Well, I mean, these projects have been going on for 15, 20 years. Not necessarily by this specific group of individuals, but these are a group of supposed archaeologists that are somehow related to Turkey. And Turkey knows they've got a gold mine here, right? They know that, people are interested. It's kind of limited in terms of the opportunities for outsiders to come in and do this research. And so like, hey, we'll take, our people here will gladly take your funds and promote this research in order to find this. And of course, the longer it takes to find, the longer you just have to keep piecing out a little bit, like here and there, like, oh, well, look, we found a little bit more. We found a little bit more, like every 2 years, like new project, we found a little bit more, but you got to keep sending us money so we can keep going here. The project began in 2021 and is ongoing, but the initial analysis determined, now what did it determine? I just love this part. Samples to contain clay and marine materials and seafood. Wow. There was some clay and marine sediments or marine materials there at this particular site on the foothills of Mount Ararat. Wow. I mean, obviously that, this is pretty astounding proof that Noah's Ark has been found. Article gets even more ridiculous. According to the first findings obtained from these studies, there have been human activities in the region since the period between 5500 and 3000 BC. 5500 is 7500 years ago, which is like way before Noah's flood. According to all young earth creationists, even 3000 BC is still 500 years before Noah's flood. In terms of dating, it stated that there was life in this region as well. This was revealed in the laboratory results that we're not going to tell you about. It is not possible to say the ship is here with the dating. We need to work for a long time to reveal this. All right, this is one time where I have to say that, I feel bad for Answers in Genesis, because they have to respond to this kind of, because I'm sure they get people who are constantly insisting that Answers in Genesis needs to get on this, right? Why don't they talk about this? Why aren't they talking about this evidence? This should be like the prime evidence when you enter the Creation Museum. It should be like right there, front and center, evidence that Noah's flood has been found. But they are not, as ridiculous as I think some of the evidence that is presented in the Creation Museum. They know that this is not solid evidence at all. And so as they had a video like, really, have they really found Noah's flood or Noah's Ark? And of course their answer is no, this is not real evidence that our Noah's Ark has been found. There's a problem with the geology is too young. These are like post-flood sediments that this in this particular area, and so therefore that the Ark can't land on sediments that were laid down after especially volcanic sediments, volcanic material that was laid down after the flood. And so none of this makes any sense. And they're correct. This is a bunch of nonsense. Okay, moving on, because we do have a lot of items today. The pre-flood world. An article on Answers in Genesis asking the question, how did Moses know so much about it? But that's a good question. I think that's a natural question to ask. Right. So, I mean, Moses living almost 1,000 years after the flood. How did he know what the pre-flood world looked about? How was he able to describe it? Now, of course, this assumes that Moses is the author of the books of Genesis. Now, historically, it's Moses is ascribed to be the authors of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, right, and Numbers. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he wrote the whole thing. I mean, he might have used source material, which is one of the things that's discussed here. But this article specifically focuses on Genesis 2:10 to 14, where Moses is describing the rivers, right? The rivers running out of Eden. And for answers in Genesis, this is always a common question because once again, it's kind of like finding Noah's Ark. Like lots of claims that, oh, this is where Noah's Ark is, and here's this evidence. They're also going to hear from their followers that, um, we should be looking for the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is described between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, or at least, somewhere around that region. And so people are always wanting to like know where the Garden of Eden is. But remember, Answers in Genesis believes that the global flood obliterated, right, the pre-flood world. I mean, literally completely obliterated because it would have ground up a lot of the surface rock and then laid it all back down in thousands of feet of sediment. And then the continents all moved around. There's been plate tectonics, and there's been mountains that have risen up, and there's been volcanoes, and there's been, I mean, it's like nothing about the pre-flood world would topology of the world would look similar to today's topology. And so when Moses names the four rivers that are involved with the Garden of Eden, how does he know what those rivers are? Especially he describes two of them as the Tigris and Euphrates, which are familiar rivers to those who live during the time of Moses himself. And so how is he referring to things, making it sound like they're contemporary when these are things that don't exist anymore? That's always been a big challenge. And so in this article, Troy Lacey goes around in circles and tries to accommodate Moses either being having divine knowledge, sort of like God just telling him things, or they were transferred through Moses and Methuselah and eventually written down, and then that was given to Noah, and Noah had them on board, and then eventually those written records were transferred to Moses, in which he's relaying the story of creation and the description of the garden and the land of Eden to the people at the time. But of course, that's to the way he describes it isn't as if he describes it very much. If, let's say, if you were standing there listening to Moses tell the story, the creation account, and especially Genesis 2, in terms of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, you would get very much the impression that he's talking about places that they would be familiar with in their own present world. But of course, they're living in a post-flood world, and so how can they understand these four rivers? Yeah, you go ahead and read this article. I mean, you're not going to be any clearer as to how to explain that after reading Troy Lacey's attempts to describe a world in which Moses is describing in the present tense because he's using the actual literal words that were written down by Adam, and so Adam was writing in his world, right? And therefore, when it gets passed to Moses, he's just repeating that as if it's sort of like present tense, like this is the world today. And so he is kind of trying to use like there are written texts, manuscripts that Moses is using to construct the books of the first few books of the Bible. Let's move on. I just want to bring this to your attention in case you're interested in this whole question of the construction of Genesis and authorial intent. And let's talk Martin Iles, right? The new CEO of Answers in Genesis, which it finally was broadcast across the various networks of Answers in Genesis. So here is the Answers in Genesis homepage, which finally featured Martin Iles as the new CEO. And clicking on this, we get to Ken Ham's blog, in which he is introducing Martin Iles once again to his audience. And then here he presents a message from Martin Iles, AIG's Chief Ministry Officer. And so after introducing him, he says here's something that Martin Iles is, has on his heart to say. And this is like what Martin Iles is like envisioning as the important goals for Answers in Genesis, right? The mission of Answers in Genesis going forward underneath Martin Iles, which is the same as what Ken Ham would have the mission to be, which is kind of like holding down the fort until Christ comes again, but also an attempt to transform culture back to the way it should be in their minds. And in doing so, he compares himself to Daniel and others that are proclaiming the coming of Babylon, how this world, well, this country in particular, the United States, is becoming like Babylon, further and further and further away from the truth. They need to be called back, right, to the authority of Scripture, which is the same thing that Ken Ham always says. And in doing so, the only thing I found interesting about this, anything that was sort of different or intriguing, was he's talking about how common grace, how God's grace is holding back his wrath against this country because of how liberal and how far astray it's gotten, right? It's become like Babylon. It's become like those countries surrounding Israel, which were so evil. But Israel had its own problems, right? And God brought his wrath upon Israel and sent them to those other nations to be in captivity as a result of their sin. But nonetheless, he's comparing the United States to Babylon and saying that God is holding off, on completely destroying this country because of grace, and giving us an opportunity to revive ourselves, right? He's giving us an opportunity to turn away from our descent into liberalism and chaos and sin. And so the way he phrased that, how long are we going to resist God's grace? How long can we raise ourselves up against God? And what he means here by raising ourselves up against God as a country is that we place ourselves above God. We think that we're God and we're our own authority. And then this is the image that apparently he decided to use in his guest blog, his guest article on Ken Ham's blog. This is the image that comes right below a whole segment in which he's talking about how man is raising himself up, and we need to raise ourselves up, right? To confront the evil that is our country, to turn away. This is the image he uses, January 6th, right? The confrontation there to, the way I read this is he thinks that is a sign of us rising up, not against God, but actually for God, against the powers that are against God. Nation, that has a culture that is being decimated by the policies of government, and we need to replace that particular government. This is really the closest that I've seen to a very definitive political statement coming out of Answers in Genesis in terms of where they lie in this cultural scene. It's not hard to figure out that that's where Ken Ham would fall, but to actually use this imagery is very direct. And I think that's something that Martin Iles is much less afraid to do so. I mean, I think he's really going all in, on the culture wars in a way that maybe Ken Ham has held back on. I think I mentioned before in the past, but it's worth saying again here. I think Martin Iles is, in a way, because he's an outsider. You might think, well, Ken Ham's an outsider. He comes from Australia, but he's been Americanized. He understands the American culture in a way that I don't think Martin Iles understands at all. And so Martin Iles comes here and he sees Australia as farther gone, right? Australia is like, even more under God's judgment, and than the United States is. The United States might actually be able to save itself if the people can rise up and overcome this evil that's within our midst. And so he sees some hope here, and so he's coming to a place where he feels like he can transform this country, but he doesn't really, I don't think, really understands the culture. And so I think that there are places and times where I think he's going to overreact to some things, not realizing the cultural sensitivities even of his own followers that are American young earth creationists here. Next up, Institute for Creation Research. I've been saying over and over again, yeah, ICR has been a really boring site to go to. I don't go to it very much. The articles are not very informative and they don't change very much. So they don't cycle new information there as much for me to keep interested in it. But I did land on this page a week ago and I saw an article I thought was uh, slightly intriguing. I'll try to make it sound kind of interesting as much as I can. It's like ICR research is revealing evidence of pre-flood longevity. So we just talked about the pre-flood world. Like how did Moses know about the pre-flood world? Right? And one thing about the pre-flood world is that is well known is the report of extremely long ages, right? People living to very long ages. And then after the flood, that lifespan tails off quite dramatically. So one question that young Earth creationists often ask themselves is like, how could people have lived that long? Um, what was it about like maybe the environmental conditions before the flood? You get these ideas. This is an old idea, but the canopy theory that's sort of blocking out UV rays and other maybe other kinds of radiation or something like that. And therefore, maybe the mutation rate of animals was lower and that allowed them to live longer. More oxygen. I mean, there's been a number of different ideas floated for longer lifespans. So ICR here has an article. They have research now that is revealing evidence for for pre-flood longevity. So one of the claims of Scripture that's most ridiculed by skeptics is the Bible's matter-of-fact assertion the ancient people once lived for hundreds of years. Although creationists have, now this is an interesting admission here, although creationists have already documented intra-Bible historical and cultural confirmation of this extreme longevity. Intra-biblical, meaning using scripture to show other scriptures are faithful. Scientific corroboration of this claim has been, till now, largely absent. We don't really have any physical evidence that people could have lived that long. Till now. Yes. So what is this new evidence? Yes. Creationists have made good arguments that this longevity is scientifically plausible. And then when you look at those two references, there are two other young Earth creationist articles that are like short little blurbs that really, they're not very good arguments. Sorry, they're just very hand wavy arguments. But scientific evidence that such longevity has actually occurred was harder to come by. In other words, proof that could actually happen. Here's an idea. Here's two ideas. Here's two arguments, but we don't actually have the evidence for them. We're pleased to say that this is beginning to change. ICR is turning the corner on this particular question. ICR research is revealing evidence within the fossils themselves that at least some animals once experienced much longer longevity than their modern day descendants do. I'm going to talk about some clam shells and a few other things like that. More than 30 years ago, creation researcher Greg Beasley deduced an important clue. And I'm not actually going to show you his quote and the rest of the article. I'll just tell you that what Greg Beasley said was, he said that maybe the reason organisms lived longer is because they basically delayed puberty. They took longer to mature. And then so you take longer to mature, then you're going to be able to live to a later age. And then there wasn't the same form of senescence, and so there's essentially indeterminate growth. And actually, that's one reason why some creationists, not many today, thought that people might have grown to like much, taller heights too. Like they were just like continually growing. And because they lived so long, they must have gotten a lot bigger than they are today. I don't think many creationists actually believe that anymore. There's limitations to height and so forth. It wouldn't matter how long you live. There's a limit. All right, so what ICR is saying is they've looked at some literature and discovered that other scientists have documented that there's evidence within some types of mollusks, some types of organisms, well, even dinosaurs, that they delayed maturity. Now, actually, in the case of dinosaurs, that's especially the big ones, it's really the opposite is suggested, especially from the fossil record. There's very few juveniles. One of the reasons there would be so few juveniles in the fossil record is because when dinosaurs are born, by the way, they're all really small because they came from eggs, right? Eggs, like the maximum size is about like this. So even a T-Rex started out tiny, but we believe they had phenomenal growth rates, kind of like birds do today, right? A lot of birds, once they hatch from an egg, they can grow incredibly rapidly in order to get to maturity because they're very vulnerable during that stage. So it doesn't really make sense that they would, that they would be delaying and taking a long time. And besides, we'd see that in the fossil record because we should have more evidence of more juveniles around. Even young Earth creationists should agree to that, because if there were a lot of juveniles around during when the flood initiated, then they should have been captured and preserved for us in the flood. So this whole article, which is 400 words, their researchers, ICR Research, is doing some lit search and maybe coming up with some things to look at some fossils, and to suggest that maybe these fossils, clams lived longer and they got a little bit bigger in the past. There's nothing controversial about that. There's nothing, I mean, it's well known that in the past there was higher oxygen concentrations, there was different environmental constraints on organisms, and it's not surprising that some organisms live longer. There are some organisms that live a long time today. It's just not, some of the ones we're familiar with don't live as long today as they might have in the past. All right, so again, I got kind of disappointed. I saw that title. I thought, well, that could be an interesting article. And as I just showed you, it's really not that interesting. Nothing terribly revelatory there. But, so I guess we better go back to Ancestry and Genesis to find something more interesting. Dinosaur feathers, more bird-like than thought. That could be a problem for Ancestry and Genesis. They have hunkered down on the whole birds have feathers and dinosaurs can't possibly have feathers. If something is called a dinosaur, it can't have a feather, right? And if it has a feather, we're not going to call it a dinosaur. We're going to call it a bird, no matter how dinosaurish it looks like. In fact, we're going to try to deny that thing even looks like a dinosaur. Or if it does look a lot like a dinosaur, but there's evidence it has feathers, we're going to try really hard to suggest there aren't really feathers. Those are protein fibers or something like that, but they weren't actually feathers. Or those were decay remnants of skin and scales that didn't kind of look feather-like. And so they make all kinds of excuses for what is pretty clearly feather preservation in the fossil record. So anyway, they're trying to hold this very in their minds clear distinction between, you got your birds, you got your dinosaurs. I mean, there might have been many created types of dinosaurs and many types of created birds, but they don't think that there's any evidence that God created basically a dinosaur, an organism with a dinosaur body plan, a dinosaur anatomy, dinosaur physiology, but it had feathers on it. Right? That seems like a problem, right? Because it's too much admitting that that sounds like an intermediate between the two, and to admit that would be to fall into evolutionary assumptions, and therefore you'd be a young Earth evolutionist. And they've written about how horrible that would be. So now comes this. I saw this title, Dinosaur Feathers. Well, in quotes, of course. It's got to be in quotes because they don't believe in dinosaur feathers. More bird-like than thought. So now, you see, most of the so-called, I love how they use that word, so-called feathered dinosaurs were actually just, what were they just? They're just birds. Archaeopteryx and so forth. Oviraptors and all these different things that we have called dinosaurs in the past. That's the thing. Most of the things they're calling birds because they have feathers on them were identified long ago in other fossils where it was unclear that they had feathers, right? They just have bones. And they were named dinosaurs because they have dinosaur anatomy, right? And they're very clearly very similar to other dinosaurs, right? There wasn't any controversy. This is a dinosaur. But once feathers are found on them, once creationists agreed, specifically Ancestry and Genesis, thought that these feathers are really feathers, then they remove it from being dinosaurs, despite there not being an evolutionary sort of assumption behind the original call that it was a dinosaur, because it's just based on bones, and Ancestry and Genesis would have probably agreed that they were dinosaurs at that time. And that likely includes Sinornithosaurus, the feathered dinosaur used in this particular study. So there's a recent study out that looks at this particular dinosaur and finds that the feathers of this dinosaur are even more bird-like than they originally thought. That this was actually a really interesting article. I'll show you a tiny bit of it in a moment. Now, here's a little background before we look at this popular summary of the study. A 2019 analysis of fossil feathers, supposedly from dinosaurs, of course, found that feathers from flightless dinosaurs mostly contain a different, more flexible form of keratin protein that was made up of modern beaks, scales, and feathers. Researchers suggested that the feathers had even evolved molecularly over time to become stiffer as birds, the last living dinosaurs. So the feathers of this particular dinosaur appeared to have a somewhat different molecular structure to modern bird feathers. And then, so in the original analysis of this fossil, these somewhat different keratin molecules were described as sort of like precursors to the final version of bird feathers later. And so that would suggest that they had some molecular changes over time to become stiffer and become more like the flight feathers of birds. So that fits a possible evolutionary explanation for the transition of this dinosaur to birds. But this new evidence suggests that no, in fact, this dinosaur did not have really flexible feathers in this alternative version of keratin, but they had a very similar version of keratin to modern birds. And so their feathers really were less flexible than originally reported, and therefore more bird-like. Now, Answers in Genesis is coming along and saying, oh, see, they had this story, they tried to fit it into an evolutionary scenario. Now they found out it's not actually right. It's actually more bird-like. They really are bird-like feathers. And of course, Answers in Genesis wants to call this thing a bird anyway. And so they're like, we were right. This is basically a, look at that, we were right. These things are actually just like birds. They're not something in between. Yeah, see, starting with God's word, we already knew that. We know that feathers didn't evolve. They couldn't have changed. They are what they are. They were created by God on day 5 in the creation week, the day he created the various bird kinds. Right, so I just want to show you what's the difference between these feathers. What did they find? This is the popular article that Answers in Genesis is referring to, but I'll show you the original article. Dinosaur feathers may have been more bird-like than previously thought. That's the title of this popular overview of the research. Here's the original article in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. Preservation of corneous beta proteins in Mesozoic feathers. Fossil proteins are valuable tools in evolutionary biology. Recent technological advances and better integration of experimental methods have confirmed the feasibility of biomolecular preservation in deep time, yielding new insights into the timing of key evolutionary transitions. Keratin, formerly alpha keratins, and corneous beta proteins, CBBs, formerly beta keratins, are of particular interest as they define tissue structures, right, that are involved in feather production. And so here's a picture of the fossil showing the feather, that especially there on the right side. And then they do a bunch of analysis of the molecular structure of the remains, right? The preserved remains of these feathers. These aren't just imprints. These contain some of the original biomolecules. So this is a form of what you might generically call soft tissue preservation, because you have some of the original biomolecules that are still here. But these biomolecules have been altered, right? They're not in their original state, right? It is the remains of original material, but those original materials have been altered through time, right? They have changed their molecular structure. And so alpha keratins refer to alpha helices. So you have the molecular structure of the keratin, which is amino acids, right? It's a protein. It's a repeating pattern of similar amino acids over and over and over again, which then fold up into these helices, right? Which can form particular structures if you get lots of helices together, all right? And they have a certain characteristics, right? Certain strength characteristics, certain, how much they can bend and which directions they can bend and so forth as helices. So now what's interesting about this research, and I just realized I might have said this backwards if I've already said this a few minutes ago, about the type of keratins that are found in these feathers. These feathers were found to have, in the original articles, the original descriptions of this fossil were found to have alpha keratins in them. Well, now alpha keratin is interesting because that's a helical structure, and of the amino acids. And so they found these alpha keratins in these feathers, in these fossils, right? So a form of soft tissue preservation. And because it's original biomolecules, except these original biomolecules are quite a bit modified. And what this newer paper finds out is they're more modified than we thought, right? Because they're super old. Wow, shocker. Because they've been there so long, the bonds between the molecules have shifted and changed, and therefore changed the shapes that they form, all right, the structures that they form. All right, so back to the alpha protein. So in the original description of these feathers, they're alpha keratins. Well, modern birds have beta keratins, right? That's what their feathers are made of. They're made out of beta keratins. And so why do these feathers have alpha keratins? That seemed to be a difference. And so the original description was like, okay, well, they're just a lot older. I mean, all modern birds have beta keratins, but maybe the original bird feathers used alpha keratins. So what this paper did was they determined that it's very likely that actually these feathers actually originally were composed of beta keratins. By looking much more closely at the molecular bonds, they found that the alpha keratins that are produced are not really, great alpha keratins. They really have aspects of being helices. But these are likely extremely modified bonds. And what they show through a bunch of experimentation how you can take an alpha keratin and you can treat it in certain ways such that the bonds are shifted and formed into alpha keratins. And so beta sheets are formed, but those beta sheets in the original feathers then gradually lost certain bonds and they reformed new bonds. And when they did that, they turned into alpha helices. Now, this is not like a completely novel thing, all right, in biochemistry. We make beta sheets and alpha helices out of from in thousands of our proteins have partly sheets and partly alpha helices. And some proteins have more of one than the other, and so forth, depending on the composition of the amino acids. But as the amino acids change over time, under the duress of being around water and other molecules, they will then reconform into other more stable molecules. Well, the alpha helix is more stable than the beta, right, sheets. And so if the beta sheets were the original form of keratin, one would expect them to fall apart essentially and reconform themselves into alpha helices. And so this is why it's said that dinosaur fossils are more bird-like than previously thought. Because original dinosaur fossils had evidence of alpha helices in them. But now with better instruments, more precise instruments that are able to look at larger portions of the molecules, we discover that, nope, these alpha helices are formed in an unnatural way, like not how you would make them directly from like genes and express them as proteins. They are extremely modified, and they simply have retransformed the molecules that were there before into these alpha helices. All right, I'm being kind of repetitive now, but I'm trying to, it's hard to get across these biochemistry ideas by a non-biochemist, namely me. All right, so that brings me back to how Answers in Genesis is they're just doubling down, tripling down, and I would say now, like I said in the headline, quadrupling down on dinosaur feathers don't exist. These are more bird-like, so therefore more evidence for us that these are just birds. But these animals, this particular species that was studied, um, by most people, including many other young Earth creationists, would say that the rest of the body plan of this organism, if you just took the feathers off and you showed it to Answers in Genesis and you told them, like, tell me, is this a dinosaur or a bird? They'd be like, that's a dinosaur because it has this feature, this feature, this feature, this feature, this feature, this feature, right? They list off a whole bunch of characteristics which they have in common with dinosaurs. And then somehow you like tack one feather on there and all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's not a dinosaur. That's got to be a bird. And this is made very clear by a couple very good articles written on the New Creation blog, a Young Earth Creationist blog. So for example, this one, Feathers by Design. I mean, they're saying God created feathers. He designed feathers, and he designed feathers for things that look similar to dinosaurs. They are a specially created kind that's not neither a T-Rex type of dinosaur, nor is it a ostrich, right? It is what it is. It's just a dinosaur-like morphology that has birds. God can do that according to them. He can create an intermediate or what appears to be a mixed organism. And so their articles are, much ado about feathers. I mean, this whole thing is a huge blow. It's actually a response to Answers in Genesis and their insistence that there is a clear distinction between dinosaurs and birds. And that is followed up by a recent series on Creation Unfolding, the YouTube station of Ken Colson, a young Earth creationist. And he had Marcus Ross and Matt McLean. And those two have spent a lot of time looking at dinosaurs, right? Paleontologists who know the literature and they know the feathered dinosaur literature. And he got them together in a live video in which they spent a couple hours going over a bunch of different fossils and talking about them. It's a really excellent video in which they cover all the features and they talk about the dinosaur-like features and the bird-like features, and they talk about the feathers, and they talk about the types of evidence for feathers and so forth. And like, as you're saying here, beta keratin only. There's no alpha keratin in modern birds. And so that goes to that article I just read, right? See, it's kind of surprising. Why do they have alpha keratin? Well, it looks like they really didn't have alpha keratin in their original state. It's a modified biomolecule. And so it still fits the bird description of modern birds. In this particular series of videos, I mean, they very, very clearly show that Answers in Genesis just don't even really know what a dinosaur is. They really can't describe it. There's just a visceral gut response on their behalf in which they want to be upset with everybody who claims that dinosaurs could have had feathers. I thought this particular illustration was kind of instructive. Matt McLean here is saying, we like our easy classification, right? You got your mammals, you've got your birds, and you have your dinosaurs. Young Earth creationists don't believe that all dinosaurs were created as one kind. They believe there's many different kinds, but still they kind of believe that there's sort of a natural group of dinosaurs that God created with the same sort of body plan in mind that they then modified into different kinds of dinosaurs. And so that's, and also on a different day, right? Day 6, whereas birds are created on day 5. That's another reason they want to have this distinction between birds and dinosaurs being created on separate days. They can't possibly have any overlap between them. But I like this figure because what he's showing here is like, yeah, you got your mammals, and it's pretty easy to define a mammal. There's a set of features, set of characteristics which every mammal shares. And so it's like, boom, you got that, you're a mammal. And then you got your reptiles. There are a set of characteristics which define all things that we commonly think of as reptiles. But there are a bunch of other things which are the synapsids, of which there's about as many different kinds of synapsids as there are mammals. Now, they're all extinct, right? They're only found in the fossil record. But they are neither mammals, nor are they reptiles, right? They have features that are mammal-like. They have some of the characteristics of mammals, but not all of them. They have some characteristics that are reptilian, right? More reptilian than they are mammal. See, so they are kind of a intermediate between the two. And what Matt Klein would say is, well, they're just creations. God made a whole bunch of different kinds of organisms called, we would generically call synapsids, but there was many different kinds of synapsids, just like there's many kinds of reptiles. But they happen to have features that are kind of like a combo package between reptiles and mammals. Well, it's like, why can't we have reptiles and birds, but in between, or why can't there be intermediate types of organisms that God created separately? So here he has pictures of a variety of different archaic bird-like dinosaurs, or feathered dinosaurs, if you will. All right. And he's pointing out that even between amphibians and fish, all right, we've got some things like tiktaalik and, these organisms that kind of have features that are more tetrapod-like than they are fish-like, but yet they're not clearly land animals, not tetrapods. They're kind of intermediates. God created those intermediates as separate different kinds. See, Andrews and Genesis just can't seem to grasp this. They feel like this is a capitulation to evolutionary biology. It's too similar to the evolutionary biology story. And so we can't accept that. It's a knee-jerk response to just take the pendulum and force it the other direction and just deny that there can be that God could have created this way. Yeah. All right, moving on. Ancient DNA. So I'm looking forward to this video. It's Carter and Creation Ministries International have just begun to promote a video that's going to be coming out called Ancient DNA, Illuminating the Tapestry of Biblical Human History. As it reads there, a brand new video by Robert Carter, Dr. Robert Carter, who's a geneticist. He's one of the few people with a bona fide genetics background in young earth creationism as a PhD, all right? Is arriving soon. Fresh discoveries of ancient DNA point to a biblically accurate understanding of origins. What you'll discover in ancient DNA. Carter takes a deep dive into the amazing and mysterious field, learn about cave bears, mastodons, look at the earliest stages of human migration out of Europe, Africa, and the New World, see how all this fits into the biblical picture, specifically the Tower of Babel and the account of Genesis. Okay, what I find interesting about this is Dr. Carter's been a little bit critical of, and rightfully so, of Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's book Traced, right? And the book Traced, right there, Traced, Nathaniel Jeanson. Human DNA's big surprise, right? And remember, Ken Ham said, Dr. Jeanson has found the Rosetta Stone of human history. Right? This is the book that explains ancestry from Noah's family and how Noah's family branched out and became all peoples on earth in the last 4,350 years. What happened to the ancient Egyptians, Persians, Romans, Mayans? Are we their descendants? Recent genetic discoveries have uncovered surprising links between us and the people of old. So here is Answers in Genesis. Ken Ham, who has paid Nathaniel Jeanson, PhD, not in genetics, to generate sort of a history of humans with DNA. And I know that, Carter saw early versions of that book and has helped him in the past on some projects. But now what we have here is we've got Dr. Carter, who has apparently been working, I know he's been working on, he's very interested in human genetics. He has his own YouTube channel on that is about sort of genetics, biblical genetics, he calls it. And I know that he's been interested in human stuff, and he's published a bunch of papers as well, sometimes with Jeanson, but with others as well, about Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA of, all right, so the female ancestry. And so he's also interested in ancestry. And now he's coming out with his own, okay, here's the history of humanity. That's going to be intriguing. That's going to be intriguing to see how his ancestry and Jeanson's ancestry, whether they butt heads at all, whether they are similar. He's using ancient DNA He's saying that you can learn more by actually looking at ancient DNA, so looking at DNA from samples from thousands of years ago. Jeanson was kind of resistant to using ancient DNA, has a bunch of reasons why he doesn't believe you should use ancient DNA. I challenged Jeanson, because he doesn't use ancient DNA of Neanderthals. I'll be interested to see if Carter accepts Neanderthal DNA, which I believe he does, and thinks it should be used in analyses. And I've challenged Jeanson to think about ancient DNA because it challenges many of his particular findings. And so here we have Carter using ancient DNA to generate a history, an ancestry of human beings. And so this is going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. And as parenthetically, whatever happened? What's happened to Jeanson? Like, where is he? What's he doing? Yes, I know he's made 3 or 4 videos that are follow-ups on this, in which he's looking at mostly North American history of Native Americans. He seems to be like really fascinated with Native American history. I mean, that's interesting, but it seems to be such a side issue to the overall global issues that Answers in Genesis is interested in, right? The whole culture wars and creation science and everything that they do, this whole thing of picking up on a small portion of human history, the peopling of the Americas. I don't understand why it takes, why you can, work for 6 months and publish 3 50-minute videos. And he's written only, 3 articles total for the Answers in Genesis website, and maybe given a couple talks. He's done a couple interviews, but the interviews are basically about traced. Um, it's an extremely small footprint on his part for how much time he spends, for like basically what he's, for what he's getting paid. When you think about that compared to Dr. Carter, Dr. Carter's produced multiple videos for his, many, many, many videos for his YouTube channel. He has written very long articles for Creation Ministries International, published several other things, plus he's made this particular video, plus he's done a bunch of other research on other things, and he's been on a bunch of other YouTube channels responding to things. The guy is really, really busy, and he goes out and he gives talks at churches. Like he's at a weekend retreat. Don't call it a retreat. He's at a weekend conference, seemingly every couple weeks. So he's traveling and he's giving talks. The guy is super busy and super productive, super wrong about a lot of things, but he is at least out there doing stuff, and he is passionate about it. And I'm not saying Jeanson isn't passionate, but he's passionate about some extremely small sliver of the world of young earth creationism. I don't know how Ken Ham pays him to do what he does, and only get what he gets from that pay. I'm curious. Salty Seas, Creation Ministries International. They've had a bunch of articles on the site. Most of them are bringing back the greatest hits from the the 90s and early 2000s. This is another one where it's like a response to an article from long ago. I just had to point this out because I've written about the salty sea argument, the idea that the sea is getting saltier and saltier and saltier because of input of salt from the land, and therefore you should be able to back calculate to when the sea didn't have any salt, and that shows that the earth can't be more than several million years old, so therefore it can't be billions of years old. That's the salty sea argument in a really simplistic nutshell. This argument is like, I can't believe it's still listed sometimes on the top 10. Like, here's our top 10 evidences, physical evidence of that the world is young, and can't be billions of years old. This isn't evidence that the world is only 6,000 years old. It's just evidence that it's not billions of years old. But it actually isn't evidence of that. And this has been talked about many, many times and explained many times. This is an old article, and yet they still have to bring it up as if like this is like this great piece of evidence. Very frustrating to me. I mean, there's just this type of stuff just represents to me how young earth creationists aren't interested in accuracy. They're not interested in intellectually engaging with the evidence and presenting truth arguments to their audience fairly. All right, this is just to fool the audience to think that, oh yeah, this is just there to continue to fool the naive audience. That's all it's there for. That's it for this week in creationism. Saw this great image on Twitter of the Dino Badlands in New Mexico. I had to go look that up where that is. It is in a very remote area of northwestern New Mexico. And I've drawn up plans for how to get there and how to visit this particular site. Actually, there's a whole bunch of sites in New Mexico I'd love to visit, and have plans to try to get out there sometime in the near future, and do my own photography at a number of these sites. I just love this particular rock because, when I see something like this, the nerd in me, the creation science nerd in me, the creationist thinking aspect of this, I look at this and immediately what flashes to my mind is like, how does a global flood deposit these sediments in this way? I mean, obviously the global flood didn't deposit the rock exactly as it looks right now, right? It deposited a whole, they're saying it deposited layers that then got sculpted, possibly by the floods retreating or some kind of post-flood events. But this is, the bottom part is this shale that's fairly weak. All right, and you have this clay stone right on top of that, and then some sandstone on top of that with a different capstone on top, which probably has a little more, it's a little more tightly cemented, and so it doesn't weather as quickly. Just the weathering forces in order to create this. This is not going to be from a receding flood creating this. This has got to be from wind and just rain here and there. It is just gradually, eroding this particular hill in these Badlands. But the incredible separation of that clay stone, which is fine sediment, versus the material below it and the sandstone above it. How does a global flood in which you have a mixture of sediments that are flowing around actually deposit a layer of like 4 or 5 inches of that? I believe it's clay stone right there. I didn't get a chance to look up the exact formation of this. And completely separate that from the sediments above and below. An old earth explanation is fairly easy to come up with for how these formations, how these rock layers are laid down, right? What the original sediments were, under what kind of depositional environments they were under, different depositional environments at different times. I see stuff like this, and I immediately just react to it as if like, how does a global flood do that? And I say that because Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham and others always make it sound like it's obvious. Like, oh, look, all these formations are easily explained by the flood. I'll say, no, they're not. They're not easily explained by a global flood. The more you look at them, the more, if you know anything about geology and geological processes, the more fantastic a global flood sounds. Especially when you go and actually visit. That's why I love going to these places and actually just like standing at these sites, touching the rocks themselves and thinking about the processes that occurred that would have made them. But hey, that's me. I'm weird. I like rocks like that. Yep, that's a wrap. That's a wrap for this week in creationism. I'm Dr. Duff, your go-to source for dissecting the myths surrounding creationism. So until we embark on another journey, stay inquisitive, stay bold. I'll catch you later on the next video. Bye-bye.